In mid-1955, the United States Army carried out a classified experiment over Savannah, Georgia, specifically the Carver Village neighborhood. From aircraft flying low overhead, the military released hundreds of thousands of mosquitoes into the air. Not for pest control, not by accident, as a Cold War test. The insects were uninfected, but that detail misses the point. The purpose was to determine whether mosquitoes could survive aerial dispersal, spread across a populated area, and actively seek out human hosts. According to Army summaries, they did. The people below were never informed. There were no warnings, no public explanation, and no acknowledgement afterward. The operation remained classified for decades. It had a name, Operation Big Buzz. And it raises a question that still matters today. What happens when fear and secrecy outweigh consent? Operation Big Buzz emerged from the early Cold War, a period defined by uncertainty and worst-case assumptions. In the years following World War II, American military planners operated under a guiding belief. If a weapon was possible, a potential adversary was already pursuing it. Biological warfare fit that mindset precisely. It was inexpensive, difficult to detect, and capable of causing widespread disruption without obvious signs of attack. World War II had already demonstrated that biological weapons were not theoretical. Investigations into Japan's wartime programs revealed that disease could be deliberately cultivated and deployed against civilian populations. For American planners, these discoveries were more than historical footnotes. They were proof that biological warfare worked. At the same time, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated rapidly. Intelligence on Soviet biological capabilities was incomplete and often speculative, but that uncertainty only heightened concern. Military planners assumed the worst. Preparation became the priority. Responsibility for this research fell largely to the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Its mandate included not only chemical agents, but biological threats and methods of delivery. A biological agent that could not reliably reach a target had little military value. Delivery became the central technical problem. Early research focused on aerosol dispersal systems, sprays released from aircraft or ground equipment. These systems worked under certain conditions, but they were vulnerable to weather, wind, and detection. Researchers began exploring alternatives that did not rely entirely on mechanical systems. Insects offered a solution that nature had already refined. They moved independently, required no guidance after release, and were already part of the human environment. Unlike bombs or chemical clouds, insects did not immediately signal hostile intent. Importantly, early entomological research was not centered on disease itself. The initial question was simpler. Could insects function as delivery systems at all? Could they be bred in large numbers, transported, released from the air, and still behave normally afterward? Answering those questions required real-world testing. Laboratories could not replicate human environments. Climate, terrain, and population density mattered. Field tests were unavoidable. By the mid-1950s, Cold War logic had normalized a troubling idea that limited experimentation involving civilian populations was acceptable if it produced data deemed essential to national security. Formal protections for human subjects were minimal, especially within classified military programs. Operation Big Buzz emerged from this environment, not as an outlier, but as part of a broader pattern of Cold War experimentation driven by fear, secrecy, and urgency. The mosquito was not an arbitrary choice. By the early 1950s, U.S. military researchers were evaluating several insects as potential delivery vectors. Mosquitoes stood out because they already occupied a well-documented role in human disease history. Of particular interest was Aedes aegypti, the so-called yellow fever mosquito. Unlike many species that feed on animals as readily as humans, Aedes aegypti showed a strong preference for human hosts. It thrived in urban and semi-urban environments, living close to people rather than remote wetlands. From a delivery perspective, this mattered. Mosquitoes did not disperse randomly. They actively sought out humans using carbon dioxide, heat, and scent. Once released into a populated area, their instincts did the work. There were logistical advantages as well. Mosquitoes could be bred in large numbers with relatively simple infrastructure. They were lightweight, compact, and easy to transport. Compared to mechanical dispersal systems, they were inexpensive and scalable. Other insects were considered. Fleas had historical associations with plague, but depended on specific animal hosts. Flies were easier to produce, but less reliable in seeking humans. Mosquitoes combined predictability, efficiency, and stealth. Crucially, Operation Big Buzz was not designed to test disease transmission. The mosquitoes used were uninfected. This was deliberate. Introducing pathogens would have complicated the experiment and raised political concerns. Before disease ever entered the equation, researchers needed to confirm that mosquitoes could survive the delivery process itself. That process imposed stress. Mosquitoes would be handled, confined, transported, and released from aircraft. If those stresses killed them or disrupted their behavior, the concept failed. Army summaries indicate that mosquitoes proved resilient enough to survive these conditions and resume normal host-seeking behavior after release. But those conclusions required confirmation under real-world conditions. To obtain that confirmation, researchers needed a populated environment where mosquito behavior could be observed naturally, without alerting the public or influencing results. By the time Operation Big Buzz moved from theory to execution, U.S. Army planners were focused on a narrow set of technical questions. The goal was not to test disease transmission, public reaction, or long-term effects. It was to determine whether mosquitoes could be handled as a delivery system under realistic field conditions. Everything about the planning reflected that limited scope. Oversight for the operation sat within the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, which at the time managed both chemical and biological warfare research. Internal summaries framed Big Buzz as a feasibility test. The mosquitoes selected were deliberately uninfected so that researchers could isolate mechanical and behavioral variables without introducing medical complications. Disease was explicitly outside the experiment's parameter. Planners identified three primary measurements. First was survivability. Mosquitoes would be bred, stored, transported, and released from aircraft. If mortality rates were too high at any stage, the concept would fail outright. Second was dispersal. Researchers needed to know how far mosquitoes could spread after release and whether they remained concentrated or dispersed unpredictably. Third was host-seeking behavior. Survival alone was not enough. The mosquitoes had to resume normal feeding patterns and actively seek human hosts. These questions dictated the choice of test environment. The location had to support mosquito survival through climate alone. Warm temperatures and humidity were essential. The area also needed sufficient population density so that mosquito-human interaction could be observed naturally, without staging artificial scenarios. At the same time, the test site had to be accessible to military aircraft and close enough to existing facilities to keep logistics manageable. Savannah, Georgia met those requirements. Within Savannah, the Carver Village area became central to the test environment. It offered residential density, favorable climate conditions, and terrain consistent with the type of environments planners believed would matter in a real deployment scenario. From a planning standpoint, it was considered representative rather than exceptional. Dispersal methods were selected for simplicity and repeatability. Declassified summaries describe the use of aircraft-mounted release devices designed to open at low altitude, allowing mosquitoes to disperse into the air below. In some reporting, these devices are identified as modified bomblets intended specifically for insect release. The emphasis was not on precision targeting, but on whether mosquitoes could survive the release process itself. Planners understood that wind and local conditions would influence dispersal, but that was considered part of the test rather than a flaw. Unlike aerosolized agents, mosquitoes were expected to compensate for environmental variability through their own behavior. That assumption was central to the experiment and needed confirmation outside the laboratory. Data collection was designed to be discrete. Mosquito recovery and observation were used to assess dispersal distance and survival. Evidence of blood feeding served as confirmation that post-release behavior remained intact. The test was structured so that all meaningful measurements could be gathered without alerting the local population. What planning documents do not include is any provision for public notification. There was no consent process, no warning, and no plan for post-test disclosure. From the Army's perspective, informing residents would have undermined the experiment by alerting behavior and potentially drawing attention to the operation. Secrecy was treated as an operational requirement, not an ethical dilemma. This approach was consistent with broader Cold War research norms. Classified tests were compartmentalized and narrowly justified. Civilian populations were treated as part of the environment rather than as participants with agency. As long as planners believed risk was minimal, consent was not considered necessary. With the planning complete, mosquitoes bred, and dispersal equipment prepared, Operation Big Buzz moved toward execution. The remaining step was to put the plan into motion and observe whether theory survived contact with reality, directly over a civilian neighborhood that had no idea it was about to become part of a military experiment. In the summer of 1955, Operation Big Buzz moved from planning to execution. With approvals in place and logistics finalized, U.S. Army aircraft took to the air over Savannah, Georgia area, carrying their unusual cargo, containers filled with live, uninfected mosquitoes. For the people on the ground, there was nothing to indicate that anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. No warnings were issued, no public notices were posted. The test unfolded quietly as designed. The release was conducted from aircraft flying predetermined routes at controlled altitudes. At specific points along these routes, the containers were opened, allowing mosquitoes to disperse into the air below. The method was intentionally simple. Researchers were not testing complex delivery mechanisms or novel aircraft systems. They wanted to know whether mosquitoes, released under basic operational conditions, could survive the drop and function as expected. Almost immediately, the insects began behaving as mosquitoes always had. Gravity carried them downward, but instinct took over once they reached breathable air. Rather than scattering randomly, they sought out familiar cues: carbon dioxide, body heat, and human scent. Residential areas, backyards, porches, and streets became the unintended testing grounds. Within hours, reports of increased mosquito activity began to surface. Residents noticed heavier than usual biting, though few, if any, suspected a deliberate cause. Savannah was no stranger to mosquitoes. Warm, humid conditions made them a routine nuisance. An uptick in bites was unpleasant, but not alarming enough to prompt questions beyond seasonal variation. For Army researchers, however, the activity was closely monitored. Traps placed throughout the test area began capturing mosquitoes that matched those released from the aircraft. This allowed scientists to confirm survival rates and measure how far the insects had traveled from their release points. The data showed that a significant number of mosquitoes survived aerial dispersal intact. Equally important were observations related to host interaction. Human volunteers stationed in designated areas recorded mosquito bites over set periods of time. These bite counts provided direct evidence that the insects were not only alive, but actively seeking human hosts after release. The mosquitoes had not been disoriented into inactivity. They resumed normal feeding behavior quickly and efficiently. The dispersal's pattern also validated planners' assumptions. Mosquitoes spread across a wide area, influenced by wind and terrain, but not crippled by them. Unlike aerosolized particles, which could disperse unevenly or dissipate rapidly, the insects adapted dynamically to their environment. They moved into shaded areas, clustered near human activity, and persisted beyond the immediate release window. From a technical standpoint, the operation was a success. The Army had demonstrated that mosquitoes could be bred in large numbers, transported by aircraft, released over a populated area, and still function as intended. The insects survived the stresses of handling and dispersal. They located humans, they bit them. What the operation did not generate was public awareness. The test remained invisible to those it affected. No explanation was offered to residents experiencing heavier mosquito activity. No follow-up occurred to assess civilian reactions or health outcomes beyond the narrow scope of the experiment. Once data collection was complete, the operation ended and the area returned to normal, at least on the surface. Internally, the lack of public response was itself considered a favorable outcome. From the Army's perspective, the test had been conducted without incident. No complaints reached officials, no press coverage emerged. The secrecy that surrounded Operation Big Buzz held. That silence was not accidental. It was a feature of the program. Public scrutiny could have raised uncomfortable questions about consent, risk, and the appropriateness of testing military concepts on civilian populations. By keeping the operation classified and limited in duration, planners avoided those questions entirely. For Savannah's residents, Operation Big Buzz passed without explanation, its purpose unknown and its existence unacknowledged. For the U.S. Army, the data collected during those flights confirmed something far more consequential. Insects could be used as effective delivery mechanisms under real-world conditions. That conclusion would not remain confined to a single test. It would inform future experiments, expand research programs, and reinforce a line of thinking that pushed biological warfare research further than many of the people involved would later admit was wise. When Operation Big Buzz concluded, the most important work did not happen in the air or on the ground. It happened afterward, in reports, summaries, and internal evaluations that assessed whether the experiment had accomplished what it set out to do. By the standards of Cold War military research, the conclusions were clear and largely unambiguous. From a technical perspective, the operation was deemed successful. The first and most basic question, whether mosquitoes could survive aerial dispersal, was answered in the affirmative. Survival rates were high enough to make the concept operationally viable. The insects endured storage, transport, and release without catastrophic loss. Whatever stresses the process imposed, they were not sufficient to render the mosquitoes ineffective. Equally important was behavior after release. Army researchers observed that the mosquitoes resumed normal activity quickly. They did not scatter aimlessly or fail to feed. Instead, they exhibited the same host-seeking patterns documented in public health studies for decades. They located humans, attempted to feed, and did so across a broad geographic area. This confirmed that the release process did not meaningfully impair their instincts. Dispersal data reinforced those findings. Mosquitoes were recovered at varying distances from their release points, demonstrating that they did not simply fall straight down and remain localized. Wind, terrain, and human activity influenced their movement, but not in ways that prevented effective coverage. Compared to aerosol-based delivery systems, the insects proved adaptive rather than fragile. Where mechanical systems were vulnerable to environmental disruption, mosquitoes adjusted. Internally, this adaptability was seen as a major advantage. The reports emphasized that mosquitoes functioned as self-guiding delivery platforms. Once released, they required no further control. They sought out targets independently, persisted over time, and blended into existing environment. From a military planning standpoint, this reduced complexity and increased reliability. Another conclusion drawn from Operation Big Buzz was scalability. The experiment demonstrated that mosquitoes could be bred and handled in large numbers without prohibitive cost or infrastructure. The logistics required were manageable. Containers, aircraft, and personnel needs were modest relative to other weapon systems under consideration. This reinforced the idea that insect-based delivery could be expanded if needed. Notably absent from the conclusions was any discussion of civilian impact beyond its relevance to data collection. The focus remained narrow: survivability, dispersal, and host interaction. Questions of consent, public reaction, or long-term consequences were not treated as variables worth measuring. In the context of the operation, civilians were environmental factors, not subjects whose experience required evaluation. The findings from Operation Big Buzz did not remain isolated. They were incorporated into a growing body of research examining entomological warfare. Subsequent tests would build on these results, refining release techniques, exploring different insect species, and examining additional variables. Big Buzz provided foundational evidence that justified continued experimentation. Importantly, the conclusions also shaped internal confidence. The Army now believed it understood the mechanics of insect-based delivery well enough to consider it a realistic component of biological warfare planning. That did not mean immediate deployment, but it did mean the concept moved from speculative to practical. From the Army's perspective, Operation Big Buzz had answered the questions it was designed to answer. Mosquitoes could be used as delivery systems. They survived release. They found humans. They worked. What the operation did not answer, because it was never asked, was whether conducting such a test on an uninformed civilian population was acceptable. That question would linger unanswered for decades, resurfacing only after the documents were declassified and the silence surrounding the operation finally broke. Operation Big Buzz was considered a technical success by the U.S. Army, but its ethical implications were largely ignored at the time. The absence of disease does not eliminate the moral problem at the heart of the test. Hundreds of thousands of insects were deliberately released over a civilian population without warning or consent. The people affected were never informed, either before or after the operation. That decision was not an oversight. It was policy. In 1955, formal protections for human subjects in military research were minimal. The ethical frameworks that would later govern experimentation, written consent, institutional review boards, and strict limitations on civilian involvement either did not exist or were not enforced within classified defense programs. Cold War urgency created an environment where secrecy and perceived necessity overrode emerging ethical concerns. From the Army's perspective, Operation Big Buzz did not involve human experimentation in the traditional sense. No one was injected, exposed to pathogens, or deliberately harmed. The mosquitoes were uninfected, and officials believed the risk posed was no greater than naturally occurring mosquito activity. This reasoning allowed planners to categorize the operation as environmental testing rather than human testing, a distinction that avoided ethical scrutiny. That distinction, however, collapses under the modern examination. The entire purpose of the test was to observe how the mosquitoes interacted with people. Human presence was not incidental, it was essential. Without humans to bite, the experiment would have failed. Civilians were not passive background conditions, they were the target variable. The lack of consent is particularly striking when viewed alongside post-war developments in research ethics. Less than a decade earlier, the Nuremberg trials had produced principles intended to govern experimentation involving human beings. Among those principles was the requirement of voluntary consent. While those standards were initially directed at medical experimentation, their underlying logic applied broadly. People should not be used as test subjects without their knowledge or agreement. Yet Operation Big Buzz proceeded in direct contradiction to that principle. Civilians were exposed to a military experiment without any opportunity to opt out, avoid exposure, or even understand what was happening. The secrecy surrounding the operation ensured that there would be no immediate public accountability. The ethical calculus of the time relied heavily on perceived intent. Because the mosquitoes were uninfected, planners viewed the test as benign. Risk was framed as minimal, temporary, and comparable to everyday environmental exposure. This framing ignored the broader implication of setting a precedent. If uninfected insects could be released without consent, the conceptual barrier to more dangerous testing was lowered. There was also an asymmetry of information and power. Military planners had full knowledge of the operation, its purpose, and its potential risks. Civilians had none. That imbalance eliminated the possibility of informed decision-making and transferred all risks to people who had no voice in the process. Notably, Operation Big Buzz was not an isolated case. It was part of a broader pattern of Cold War-era testing that included chemical releases, aerosol experiments, and other classified trials conducted in populated areas. In each case, secrecy functioned as both a shield and a justification. If the public did not know, there would be no protest. If there was no protest, the test could proceed. Only decades later, when documents were declassified and historians began piecing together the scope of these programs, did ethical evaluation catch up with technical assessment. Viewed through a modern lens, Operation Big Buzz represents a clear crossing of a line. The absence of immediate harm does not negate any violation of autonomy and trust. The operation demonstrated something more than a feasibility of mosquito-based delivery. It revealed how easily ethical boundaries can erode when national security is involved. What was once considered acceptable experimentation now stands as a cautionary example. The next question, inevitably, is how long such experiments remained hidden, and what it took for them to finally come to light. For decades after Operation Big Buzz concluded, it effectively vanished from public awareness. There were no press reports, no official acknowledgments, and no follow-up disclosures to the communities affected. The operation existed only in classified reports and internal memoranda, buried among thousands of Cold War research documents that few outside the military ever saw. That silence was not accidental. It was the intended end state. During the 1950s and 1960s, biological warfare research remained one of the most tightly controlled areas of U.S. defense policy. Programs were compartmentalized, code-named, and shielded from external oversight. Even within the military, knowledge was restricted to those with a direct need to know. Operation Big Buzz, having produced its data and fulfilled its purpose, required no further discussion. It was filed away and forgotten. The rediscovery of Big Buzz did not come from a single dramatic revelation, but from gradual erosion of secrecy. Beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, public trust in government institutions began to fracture. Vietnam, Watergate, and revelations about domestic surveillance created pressure for greater transparency. Classified Cold War programs increasingly came under scrutiny. One turning point was the U.S. government's decision to renounce offensive biological weapons in 1969. As part of that shift, some documentation related to earlier research programs became eligible for review, declassification, or disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. What emerged over time was a fragmented but increasingly clear picture of how extensive Cold War testing had been. Operation Big Buzz surfaced through this process, pieced together by historians, journalists, and researchers examining declassified Army Chemical Corps records. The documents were clinical and unemotional. They did not describe controversy or public concern. They described procedures, results, and conclusions. In doing so, they revealed just how routine such testing had been. Public reaction, when the story finally reached wider audiences, was muted compared to later revelations about chemical testing or nuclear exposure. Big Buzz lacked dramatic imagery. There were no explosions, no immediate casualties, no obvious victims stepping forward with clear injuries. For many readers, it seemed abstract, disturbing, but distant. That relative obscurity is part of why Operation Big Buzz remains less well known than other programs like Project Shad or other Cold War testing initiatives. It did not involve service members in confined spaces or clearly defined exposure events. The people affected were civilians who often had no way of knowing they had been part of a test at all. Nevertheless, the rediscovery of Big Buzz contributed to a broader reassessment of Cold War research ethics. It reinforced the realization that secrecy had enabled experiments that would not have survived public scrutiny. It also demonstrated how easily technical success could be separated from moral accountability. For some historians, Big Buzz became a case study in normalization. The operation was not framed as extraordinary by those who planned it. It was treated as a logical step in an ongoing research program. That normalization is precisely what made it dangerous. When extraordinary actions become routine, ethical alarms stop sounding. Today, Operation Big Buzz exists primarily as a historical reference, an example cited in discussions of entomological warfare, government secrecy, and civilian exposure during the Cold War. It is rarely discussed in isolation. Instead, it appears as part of a pattern, a supporting piece of evidence in a larger argument about how far military research once went and how little oversight it faced. The question left behind by its rediscovery is not simply what happened, but why it was allowed to remain hidden for so long, and what other programs required similar excavation before their full implications were understood. Operation Big Buzz ended in 1955, but its implications did not. While the test itself was limited in scope, the conclusions drawn from it shaped how the U.S. military and other governments thought about biological delivery systems for years afterward. Big Buzz demonstrated that nature could be leveraged as infrastructure, and that living organisms could be integrated into weapons planning with minimal technological complexity. In the years that followed, entomological warfare remained an area of quiet interest. Subsequent tests explored different insects, release methods, and environmental conditions. Even as policy shifted away from offensive biological weapons, the knowledge gained from these programs did not disappear. It became part of institutional memory, informing defensive planning, threat assessment, and countermeasures. The most enduring legacy of Operation Big Buzz, however, lies not in what it proved technically, but in what it revealed about decision-making under fear. The Cold War rewarded speed, secrecy, and decisive action. Ethical reflection lagged behind technical capability. Once a method was shown to work, questions of whether it should be used were often deferred or quietly ignored. This pattern has not disappeared. Modern debates over scientific research frequently echo the same tensions that surrounded Big Buzz. Advances in biotechnology, genetic engineering, and pathogen research raise similar dual-use concerns. Techniques developed for public health, agriculture, or medical research can be repurposed for harmful ends. As in the 1950s, the line between defense and offense is often thin and contested. Public trust plays a central role in these debates. Operation Big Buzz eroded that trust retroactively. When people learn that their government once conducted secret experiments on civilians without consent, it colors how they interpret contemporary assurances. Transparency becomes harder to accept at face value. Skepticism grows, even when research is conducted legitimately. There are also parallels in how risk is framed. In 1955, the Army justified Big Buzz by emphasizing that the mosquitoes were uninfected and that the danger was minimal. Today, similar language appears in discussions of experimental research deemed low risk or unlikely to cause harm. History shows how easily such assessments can be influenced by institutional priorities rather than public values. Another lasting impact of Big Buzz is its role in shaping oversight mechanisms. The exposure of Cold War testing programs contributed to the development of stricter ethical standards, review boards, and legal requirements governing human subject research. These safeguards did not emerge spontaneously. They were reactions to past abuses and questionable practices. Big Buzz helped build the case for why those safeguards were necessary. Yet even with modern oversight, the temptation to operate in secrecy remains, particularly in areas tied to national security. Classified research continues. The difference today is that there is greater awareness of the risks posed by unchecked authority. That awareness is itself a legacy of programs like Big Buzz. Ultimately, Operation Big Buzz serves as a reminder that technological feasibility does not equate to moral legitimacy. The operation succeeded because it asked a narrow question and ignored broader consequences. It proved mosquitoes could be used as delivery systems, but it also demonstrated how easily civilian populations could be reduced to variables in an experiment. As governments continue to confront new threats, real and perceived, the story of Big Buzz remains relevant. It warns against allowing fear to dictate policy without accountability, and it underscores a lesson that remains unresolved. Once a line is crossed in the name of security, it is rarely uncrossed without public reckoning. Operation Big Buzz was never meant to be remembered. It was designed to produce data, validate a concept, and then disappear into classified archives. For the U.S. Army, it did exactly that. The mosquitoes survived, they dispersed, they found people. From a technical standpoint, the experiment worked. What failed was not the science, but the restraint surrounding it. The residents of Savannah were not warned, informed, or asked. They were exposed to a military experiment without their knowledge, and then written out of the story entirely. For decades, the operation remained hidden, not because it was a mistake, but because secrecy was the easiest way to avoid accountability. It is tempting to dismiss Operation Big Buzz as a product of its time, a relic of Cold War paranoia and outdated thinking. But that explanation is too convenient. The mindset that enabled Big Buzz did not vanish when the Cold War ended. It merely adapted. Fear still drives policy. Secrecy still offers cover. Technical success is still used to justify ethical shortcuts. Big Buzz matters because it shows how quickly extraordinary actions can become routine when they are shielded from public scrutiny. No diseases were released, but a precedent was set. A line was crossed quietly, without protest, because the people affected were never given the chance to object. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame retroactively. It is about recognizing patterns before they repeat. Transparency, consent, and accountability are not obstacles to security. They are safeguards against abusing it. Operation Big Buzz did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because no one outside the program was allowed to see it. And that may be the most important lesson. When governments operate entirely in the dark, even successful experiments can leave behind a long shadow. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does remember who was never told. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.